And I want to thank you all to coming for this event. And my name is Clara, and I'm a member of FUF Stockholm Södra, which is about a year old established association, and we have about 180 members at this point. So before we start this webinar, I will give you a short introduction to FUF. So for the ones that are not familiar with FUF, we are the Swedish Development Forum, and we're an association driven by volunteers passionate about raising global development debates among young people and students in especially Stockholm, but also from all around the world. So if you wonder anything, or if you want to know more about us or join us as an association, feel free to contact us in social media or anything similar. You can also ask us a question in the chat. So secondly, we have some changes in the schedule for today. Dr. Amsat was supposed to join us, but due to some problems with flying in Africa from certain countries, he could not make it, and he's actually delayed in the airport. However, we have Dr. Almamy, Sylla. So we will thank you so much for joining us, and he will be presenting together with Jesper today. So with the help of these two, this event will discuss some ideas and perspectives surrounding international relations in Africa and the Swedish influence on that, and Mali, and this just that overall general discussion surrounding these topics that Jesper and Almamy is researchers in. So just to introduce Jesper a bit, he's a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute and associate professor in cultural anthropology, which with an interest in migration and mobility through wartime and peace in West Africa. He's also founder of a collaborative research group on African migration, mobility, and displacement. And then we have Dr. Almamy Sylla, that is also in the same field of research, but from the University of Humanities and Social Science of Bamako. He is also a member of other research projects in West Africa and focuses on infrastructure and mobility in Mali. So he has more of a focus on migration policies, gender, and social innovation in Mali. So that is around what we will be hearing about today. Before we start this webinar, I will also have to remind you some key points. That is that we are recording this seminar and we'll share it on FUF's YouTube channel. So if you do not want to be part of that, please turn your cameras off. And secondly, please be muted throughout until the question part starts. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or send them to Johanna, who will then later on use those in the discussion part that is in the end of this. So the schedule for today was something like this, but then Jesper and Almamy will use their own flow in whatever way you think will be best suited for today. So that's up to you, Jesper and Almamy. So that is all from me. Is there anything you want to add, Jesper, or do you want to start sharing your screen?
Well, thank you very much, Clara, and thank you, FUF, for the kind invitation. I think I'll just jump into my presentation. So the division of labor, so as you may have understood, Almamy Sylla from the University of Bamako was kind enough to jump in at the last minute. So the division of labor between us will be that I will get us started with the presentation that I'm searching for now on my desktop. Oops. And then I'll hope to inspire Almamy to raise some issues on the basis of this presentation. So we're not expecting Almamy to provide a full presentation here, also to come you, Almamy. So I hope to compared to what I had thought originally, I'm hoping to maybe broaden the scope a little bit in terms of giving you a picture of Mali's international relations today. And I hope that we can then either in the discussion go deeper into understanding what is happening specifically in Mali and perhaps in the Sahel region, but also maybe broaden the discussion to more general issues about international interventions and sort of geopolitical perspectives on international collaborations. That's really up to those of you listening and watching. Essentially what I thought I would do now is to provide you in about half an hour, provide you with some background to the current sort of political, social scenario in Mali and how it has been sort of crucially affected by international collaborations and international presences in different ways over the past 10 years or so. And then I'll end by reflecting a little bit more specifically on the role of Sweden and the Nordic countries in a region like the Sahel, which I hope will then lead us into an interesting discussion. So for those of you familiar with Mali, bear with me if this is a bit simplistic and if I take too long to sort of outline the broader picture. But for those of you maybe less familiar with the country and the region, I hope this can serve as sort of a common frame of reference for our discussion later on. So to begin with just some background information, here we are is an overview of West Africa. You see Mali there nicely located in the middle. You can see it's an impressively large country. You can also see that there's no coastline, and you can see to the left here that Mali figures on the low end of the Global Development Index scale. Along, by the way, with other countries in the region, such as Niger and Burkina Faso. You can also see that Mali's population is growing quite rapidly. It's projected to continue to do so for the next generation. So a general sort of social issue that many countries, I think across the continent, is fair to say, are sort of facing over the next 20, 30 years is sort of a fairly intensive population growth. You can also see here that on the map that the population is centered in the southern part of the country. The northern parts of the country are not that densely populated, as you can see here in the very light color. And that is quite significant in understanding what's happening politically and socially right now.
I'm sorry, Jesper, could I use, I think when you move a lot, your mic sounds a bit. So if you could maybe hold your mic or similarly, that would be better.
Sorry.
No problem.
Is this a little better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. But anyway, I don't want to make you seasick, so I'll try to not move too much. All right. So Mali is a relatively poor country, and most of the territory is located in the Sahel belt, which borders the Sahara Desert, so it's quite arid. But there is sort of an important agricultural production, primarily subsistence agriculture. Mali and the region is also known for its cattle nomads who travel large distances with their herds of cattle to find grazing grounds and water sources. And then in recent years, Mali has also become sort of associated, at least looking from a distance or from Europe, associated with migration towards the North African coast and onwards towards Europe. So Mali is sometimes considered a transit country where migrants from other parts of the sub-region travel through to reach Northern Africa. And Mali also has a long historical sort of bond to Europe in terms of transnationalism and different migration flows, which is something more familiar to the work of both Almamy and myself, but maybe we can leave that for another time. And then in the sort of fairly recent years, in the past 5-7 years, Mali has become one of the countries in West Africa associated with quite a gold rush. There are new finds of gold in southern Mali, and there's sort of an intensive now extractive industry targeting the gold resources. The region generally is known for its sort of rich mineral possessions, but the gold rush is fairly recent. And it's located in the southern parts of Mali towards the borders with Guinea and Senegal. You can see here that the production has been rising quite significantly. Oh, someone has their mic on. I don't know. I don't mind, but maybe they don't want to say something they regret on camera, on video. Right, so you can see here that the production of gold in Mali is rising quite rapidly, which means that it has become the primary export resource of the country, now around 70% of Mali's international exports. And also part of that production around gold mining is done by more informally and small scale by what is usually referred to as artisanal miners in the region. Just to round up the background a little bit, I mean, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, this is not a picture, by the way, from Mali, but the COVID-19 pandemic is having fairly significant impacts. I mean, one thing is the spread of the disease itself. Mali has been relatively spared of casualties to the pandemic, but there has been significant restrictions on people's possibility to move, both within the country and especially across borders in the sub-region. But what is really important is that the whole region is in an economic recession, primarily because of the pandemic, which has decreased international investments and really sort of retracted international money flows to the region overall. There's also a problem with food production chains, especially foodstuffs that are imported to Mali, such as wheat and corn. So there is sort of a looming hunger crisis, not just in Mali, but in the entire region, which in part relates to the effects of the pandemic. And then, of course, we can't forget the ongoing war in the Ukraine, which is also impacting West Africa, both in terms of security policy priorities. So European countries, for example, are less likely to be interested in investing in security missions to West Africa right now when things are sort of as they are in Europe. But there's also the economic impact of the war, including the rising prices on food, but also on fuel, for example. Yeah, maybe that's a gloomy way to sort of summarize the background of how to understand Mali as a country in the Sahel region. But let me just look a little bit closer at some of its political challenges right now, which I think are important also to understand, first of all, why there is a quite significant international presence in Mali, but also to understand why some of these international interventions have gone quite badly over the past 10 years. So Mali has seen 3 coups in the last 10 years, 2 of them very recently. I'll come back to that. So in 2012, the president at the time, usually referred to as ATT, Amadou Toumani Touré, was ousted by a military junta, which eventually gave way to new elections in which Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who is usually referred to as IBK, was elected as president. This was a time when there was a lot of frustration around sort of state corruption, the lack of livelihood opportunities, sort of fairly familiar frustrations from the population against the ATT government, and the military stepped in and sort of claimed the role of ensuring a transition to a new and better government. What happened though was that IBK, or Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, proved to be not that much of an improvement. He was accused of favoring his own family and his closest allies, giving them important government positions and using state funds for his private purposes. So there was a lot of very familiar scandals around him as a president as well. Sorry. What also happened during the leadership of IBK was that there was an escalation of a long-standing conflict with groups in the north, which I will come back to. So his presidency became quite turbulent and quite unpopular. And around 2020, well, starting in 2019, I guess, there was sort of a significant public mobilization against him, which gradually escalated and became what is now known as the 5th June movement, or the M5, which was able to mobilize, as you can see here, large masses of people protesting against the government and the president, and eventually demanding that he step down. Part of this mobilization was also, and this comes back to the question of that we're talking about today, the question of international interventions in Mali and the region. Part of the mobilization was also a frustration with the role of France. I'll come back to the conflict dynamics in a little bit, but it's important to note that in the former French colonies, so the French-speaking countries in West Africa, there has long been this ambivalent relationship with France. France has kept a close political and diplomatic relationship with most of its former colonies. And of course, there have been mutual advantages in that relationship, but there's also been sort of a consistent frustration that both populations and the political class in these countries have felt that France is too engaged, is too sort of close to its role as a colonial power, which is the subject that our other speaker, who was unable to be here today, was supposed to talk about, the notion of Françafrique, the idea that there is this continued post-colonial relationship between France and its former colonies. But that was really sort of on display in the mobilization against the IBK government, where people, as you can see, were holding up signs saying, France dégage, France, go home, get out of here. Looking back now, it's important to understand that the military coups that followed in 2020, which have led to the junta that is currently ruling Mali, it wasn't that obvious that it would be a military takeover. So you had this broad public mobilization with the political opposition, civil society groups, just ordinary Malians rallying behind this M5 movement, demanding that IBK would step down. And in the midst of this public mobilization, a small group of military officers stepped in and sort of carried this momentum of public mobilization to then arrest the president and declare a military takeover. The first time most recently that this happened was in August 2020. And the junta, called CNSP, eventually installed a former Minister of Defense, Ban Dao, as a transitional president. But just a little less than a year later, in May 2021, that transitional president was then arrested by the same junta who was saying that he was taking liberties in his role as transitional president. And it was really about him trying to marginalize the influence of the junta in the transitional government. So this led to another military coup, less than a year later, in which then the junta leader, Assimi Goïta, took over the role as transitional president and was sworn in. So the military junta became the leader of the military junta became the transitional president, as you can see here. So at present, to my understanding, there is quite a sort of significant public support behind the CNSP and the military junta and its leader, Assimi Goïta. The strongest reactions against this military rule has been from the outside, especially from European actors. But there are some, I mean, regardless of how you see the political game playing out, there are some fundamental problems in Mali that has led to this repetition of a cycle where you have a military coup, a transitional period, a new civilian government, and then a new military coup. And however you want to look at that, that's not a very sort of productive democratic process. You could argue that sometimes a military coup is necessary if the regime in power is abusing its power to undermine democracy, et cetera, but there is this vicious cycle, which in part has to do with the way the Malian state is structured. I'm not really an expert at all on this, but it also has to do generally, and this is something I think is important maybe to take up in the discussion, with the fact that military coups in West Africa are possible to do without very sort of concerted international condemnation. There is a certain international passivity when we see military coups in West Africa, even today. And you can see there have been recent coups in Guinea and in Burkina Faso in the same region as well. I've already said too much, but I could say much more about this, but I won't for now. We can maybe come back to it later. So that's sort of some of the political challenges right now. The military junta has said that it needs at least 3 years to ensure a transition to a civilian, to new elections and a civilian government. There's been massive international criticism of that time plan, and international actors are pressuring the junta to shorten that transitional period. Again, I think it's fairly, I mean, it's up to discussion a little bit, to debate whether, you know, on the one hand, you want to push too hard and just have elections that won't really be free and fair, or whether you're allowing a military junta to just remain in power. But that's maybe for another day or for the discussion later. I want to move on to explain part of the reason why the political situation in Mali has been so unstable and why there has been a need for an international intervention. And this leads me to talking about regional jihadism in the Sahel. Mali is in the midst of an escalating armed conflict. I've sometimes referred to it as a security crisis, but I think that's becoming too sort of a milder term. This is sort of an outright armed conflict, even though it has changed its dynamics quite significantly. It's not just a war in the conventional sense, but there is an armed conflict going on. And part of that started in 2012, when northern Tuareg groups organized a separatist uprising. I'll explain a little bit more about it. But within a few years, that initial uprising was sort of controlled in part by the help of the military assistance of France. But violent clashes continued, and it became clear that there was a presence of other armed groups in the country, many of them with a jihadist ideological heading, and several of them with links to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. What we have then seen in the past 3, 4, 5 years is that the presence of jihadist groups, which is, I'll explain a little bit more later, has gradually destabilized, especially the north and the center of the country, which has led to escalating local conflicts and also to the expansion of the number of different armed actors on both sides in this conflict. So let me just go into a little bit more detail about this very complicated and worrying situation in Mali. And one thing that I think is important to understand in all of this, and it leads back to the question about the role of the junta currently in power, is that there has been massive questions raised internationally about the role and conduct of the army in Mali. And I'll also come back to that. All right, so just very briefly, in 2012, what has been sort of a long-standing political tension between traditionally nomadic groups called the Tuareg in north of Mali and the central government escalated into armed conflict. And the Tuareg groups were claiming, they were fighting to claim more independence. Some of the factions of these groups were claiming to sort of want to establish a new Tuareg state. Others were just trying to pressure the government for more influence on their own conditions. And there was also an issue of rights to access of land, etc. One of the groups that are still active today, despite the changing dynamics of the conflict, is the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, MNLA. And in 2012, they were outright separatists. They were trying to establish a new Azawadi state, including Mali, but also parts of some of its neighboring countries. As I said, France was invited to intervene militarily in Mali at that point, and was sort of met with celebration that France stepped up and helped the Malian army defeat the Tuareg uprising. But what happened was that during this presence of French military forces in the country, these jihadist groups that I mentioned started gaining more traction and started conducting targeted attacks on actors connected to the international community, to put it very broadly. So famously in 2015, there was an attack on the Radisson Blu Hotel in the capital of Bamako, which led to a hostage situation and several people being killed. And we saw similar attacks also in Burkina Faso over the next 2-3 years, with these groups being very targeted in attacking either sort of hotels known to host expatriate visitors, or parts of sort of state premises that were hosting international armed forces or something similar. So it was a very specific target towards the international community to begin with. Since 2015, first of all, the armed conflict in the region and in Mali has escalated significantly. I don't have the most recent numbers, but you can see the number of casualties here rising quite exponentially. And there are also a growing number of different armed actors being involved. Right now, there are two sort of umbrella organizations of jihadist groups active in Mali. One is called JNIM, and it is believed to have ties to Al-Qaeda, and it's operating what you see here in the brownish yellow coloring here, mainly in the central Mopti region of Mali. And then you have the Islamic State in the greater Sahel, which is believed to have, which has ties to Islamic State, which is operating in the Liptako-Gourma border region between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. And it is important to underline that this is a regional conflict that Mali is a part of. And this has been an escalating tendency where the initial violence was quite centered in northern and central Mali. It has now spread into the Sahel region. You can see here the numbers of casualties in the 3 primary countries affected. So these jihadist groups are not operating just in Mali, and their purpose doesn't seem to be to gain sort of territorial control necessarily. In my understanding, what their main purpose is to challenge the state authorities in these regions, sometimes claiming to want to install some kind of Islamic rule. But what is also clear is that they are very keen on keeping a regional trafficking corridor open through which you can traffic arms, minerals, money, sometimes people, sometimes drugs. So there's, and some groups are doing one more than the other. So it's a very complicated and very sort of destabilizing situation in Mali and the rest of the region. And you can see also here that there are sort of massive displacements as a consequence of this insecurity situation. You have more than 1 million internally displaced people in Mali, and more up towards 1.5 million in Burkina Faso right now. And you can see again that the displacement trend is that numbers are growing by the day, unfortunately. Again, I think I'm already taking too much time on this, but just to sort of be clear about what these groups are and what they're fighting for, it is quite difficult to say something about generally. Also, I'm not an expert, so maybe there are people in the virtual room with more knowledge than me. But we have seen, for example, here you see, I believe this is from Timbuktu in Western Mali, statements about wanting to impose Sharia law in parts of Mali. So there is some sort of messaging towards forwarding an Islamist ideology and also imposing some degree of territorial control. But that is not the purpose of all these armed groups. And sometimes it seems that they're willing to sacrifice territory in order to retreat and then attack in different places. Are they trying to access state power to take over entirely in a coup? It doesn't really seem so. There doesn't seem to be a concerted movement towards Bamako, which is, as far as I've understood. Are they targeting natural resources? That's often something you assume when you have an armed conflict, especially outside Europe, is that there are natural resources involved. I think that is the case to some extent. We've seen attacks on international mining companies, for example. But what you can see is that the conflict is centered in the center and the north of the country, and most of the mineral resources are in the south. So it doesn't seem at least to be the primary target. What does seem to be happening, though, is that natural resources are funding many of these groups. So they're using their trafficking channels to export the natural resources and fund their operations that way. There's also a worry that the jihadist groups in the region are sort of playing on ethnic identity in the region and in Mali specifically to play out different ethnic groups against each other. I think that's only part of the story as well. There has been sort of a long history of both of political and social tensions between different groups. Famously, the sort of what is usually called the farmer-herder confrontation between ethnic Peul and ethnic Dogon. But I also think there's a tendency to simplify the role of ethnicity in these kinds of conflicts. So I wouldn't want to overstep that dimension as well. As I've already said, and I'm sorry to be a bit repetitive here, but the conflict is really escalating. What is important, and I think this is something I want to emphasize, is you can see here the coloring that the actors responsible for civilian deaths in Mali over the past 3 years has not just been jihadist groups. Here you can see the jihadist groups marked in the green. It's actually also local defense groups and the state forces, the Malian Army, that are responsible for significant civilian deaths in Mali. And that's really a fundamental problem. Yeah, I think I won't go too much into detail here. So, but there are, the Malian Army has invested in local defense groups. You see some here that are being used in the fight against jihadist groups, but there have also been committing abuse and killings of them. They're hard to control, and their mandate is not really clear. And they may actually be sort of escalating the conflict rather than de-escalating it by their conduct. That's sort of something we could also talk more about if you're interested. Another significant actor here is, of course, the Malian Army. They have also been accused of quite significant sort of abuses and killings of civilians. This is ongoing now, even under the military junta. And then there is this politically ambivalent role of the military in Mali. It's sometimes difficult to understand whether they're acting in line with the central government or against it. So a very long story to get to talking more specifically about international interventions. But I think it is quite important to understand that we're talking about a relatively poor country, which has suddenly seen an explosive sort of revenue from natural resources, especially from gold. And we've seen this very complicated conflict scenario, in part lead to a very complicated political situation with successive military coups. So I think that's an important background to really establish and also acknowledge that it is really complicated before we talk about the international interventions. All right, so let me move on to that. The largest international presence in Mali today is the UN-led MINUSMA mission, which includes both an army support and a support of the Malian police forces. So here you can see an overview of the numbers of international actors in both the army and the police, and also on the right here, the countries where the staff is coming from outside of Mali. And of course, you can note here, and this is important, that the main military and police contributors are African, not European, in the MINUSMA force. When you hear about MINUSMA in international news, you often hear about the European part of this massive operation, right? But if you look at the numbers, it's actually African countries contributing staff to the missions, primarily. Then we have the by now infamous Opération Barkhane, which is the French-led military operation. You can see here the map is showing the progress of incidents, but also the French flags indicating the military presence of Barkhane in Mali and the region. This is, and I'll come back to this, this is one of the operations that is scaling down now after France decided to withdraw much of its military presence. But you can see that this is quite a sort of a significant military presence, and it's the one that's been given most attention as well. In combination with the more specialized task force Takuba, which is an elite force contingent, which is, as far as I understand it, it's part of the Barkhane operation, but operates quite independently. This is the group that was sort of dramatically, or the mission that was dramatically ended by France earlier this year in response to some demands from the military junta in terms of how it operates. So Emmanuel Macron, France's president, has declared that France is withdrawing militarily from Mali because they cannot collaborate with the military junta currently in power. And Task Force Takuba is the one that was sort of most significantly affected to begin with. But there's a planned withdrawal of the entire Barkhane mission as far as I've understood. And much of their mandate and some of their manpower will just simply go into the UN mission, but others will and are leaving Mali. In addition, there's also a regional military collaboration called the G5 Sahel. It includes the 5 Sahelian countries: Mauritania, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And it hasn't really been that effective so far. There's been sort of regular summits of the G5 Sahel politically, but militarily it hasn't been, as I understand it, quite as sort of efficient on the ground. And then you have the European Union training mission in Mali, which is mainly intended not to sort of engage in direct combat, but rather to train Malian military and personnel. And Sweden has contributed to both MINUSMA and the Barkhane mission and to the European training mission. You can see the numbers of Swedish troops here. Until recently, at least. So these are the numbers from last year. So what Sweden has done is that Sweden, along with Denmark as well, has signaled that they are withdrawing in line with France from the French-led missions, at least, from Barkhane and from Task Force Takuba. I'm not exactly sure what will happen with the Swedish forces in MINUSMA. As far as I know, the plan now is to remain until March next year. And then the Swedish armed forces have informed Parliament that the Swedish Parliament that they will be withdrawing at that time. I think that's a parliamentary decision, but I'm not entirely sure about the details. So there are still Swedish troops in Mali, but the plan is to withdraw them because of the current political situation. And then finally, this brings me to talk a little bit more about Sweden's role in relation to international interventions, also in a sort of in a bit of a broader light. And I'd like to talk about that from the perspective of thinking about Nordic exceptionalism. So let me explain what I mean by that. So the main European presence in Mali is and has been since, well, since colonialism has been France in this part of West Africa. As you know, there's been sort of a dramatic shift in the relationships between France and Mali, leading Macron then to withdraw much of France's military presence in Mali. So the discussion around France here, in part, is a discussion about what will happen with the military intervention against jihadist violence in Mali. And here there are concerns, of course, that the withdrawal of international troops will leave a security vacuum, which will affect the Malian population. It will make it easier for jihadist groups to operate in Mali. But there's also a discussion about the results of the international intervention since 2012. And here the results have been miserable. There's been very little progress. We might say that we don't know how the situation would have looked if there had not been an international intervention, but French troops are accused of contributing to the escalation of violence rather than the de-escalation of violence, in part because France has bet everything on a strategy that takes military action first and diplomacy later. What the Malian government, and now the current military government as well, has been saying is that there is a need to dialogue with jihadist groups. And that idea goes against the European and the sort of the Western view that we do not negotiate with terrorists. But that whole idea is not sort of aligned with, first of all, the role of these groups, these jihadist groups in the region, but also the way conflict resolution has worked in this part of West Africa historically. So there's a much stronger emphasis on dialogue, even with your worst enemies. And there's been resistance against the French insistence on targeting jihadist groups and using military action first. There's also a larger discussion about whether we're seeing the end of Françafrique, the end of France's dominant diplomatic and political role in its former West African colonies. And many people are quite happy about that. Many people have been frustrated, both politically, but also just sort of the man on the street or the woman on the street kind of thing, have been quite frustrated with the sense that that France has too much influence on national politics in a country like Mali, has too much influence on trade agreements, etc. So there's sort of, again, an ambivalent debate around what the consequences will be of France's withdrawal. Now, if you take that debate and look at it with European eyes, of course, the main question has been, first of all, you know, there's this whole sort of insulted feeling in many parts of Europe that why is Mali not more grateful for the work that European actors has done in the country? How could the military junta sort of do this and reject the international presence? But there's also a concern about who will take over, who will fill the security vacuum once France leaves. And of course here, the influence of Russia is the main focus of European attention. And in Mali, that presence right now is primarily through what is known as the Wagner Group, which is a private Russian company providing security solutions across the globe. They have been active in the Central African Republic, for example, and they're essentially sort of mercenaries, a mercenary company. They do provide consultation as well as actual combat officers, but they are currently being they're under investigation for systematic abuse and extrajudicial killings. they may end up, or I'm not sure if they are already on the EU's sanction list because of their conduct. So especially from European eyes, but I think we can say somewhat objectively, this is a problematic group. But they have been welcomed now by the Malian military government and to some extent by the Malian people to sort of present an alternative to France in the region. Maybe that is something we can also talk more about, this sort of the geopolitical questions around the presence of Russia and this Wagner group. So finally, this leads me then to where are the Nordic countries in all of this? So we've seen, or I've tried to sort of sketch the notion that France has been the dominant European power historically and even today, both politically and militarily. But I've also shown that Sweden, for example, is contributing military personnel to the international interventions. Also, of course, Sweden has a long-standing development cooperation with Mali since 2001, I believe. So Sweden is very much present. And in general, the Nordic countries have been able to sort of, and to some extent legitimately, draw on not having the same problematic colonial history in the region as France. I'm not saying that the Nordic countries do not have a colonial history. They very much do. Denmark is still sort of a colonial power in the sense that that Greenland is not an independent country, but there's also been a colonial presence in West Africa, for example, in what is today Ghana, by both Sweden and Denmark, but that's maybe for another time. But anyway, overall, Sweden and the other Nordic countries have been able to sort of claim that, or to use the fact that our countries have a different historical relationship with the West African region. We are not the former colonial power. We don't have the same claims to sort of diplomatic influence as France, etc. What is becoming clear is that public opinion in West Africa, and especially sort of the attitude of West African politicians, is not necessarily that one European country is exempt for the same critique as the one directed towards France. So one example of this is that prior to the French withdrawal from Mali, Denmark was supposed to expand its presence in Mali with 100 troops that they were sending to join the already existing Danish troops in Mali. At the point where these troops were arriving in Mali, the military government intervened and said that the appropriate protocol had not been respected and that these troops had not been allowed by the military government to enter Mali, and they were sent home. The discussion around this incident was that this was the military government's, the military junta's way of signaling generally that they were quite tired with the international presence. And it was sort of an easy target compared to a direct action towards France. It was easier to target Denmark rather than France in this kind of a sort of symbolic act of setting their foot down. And this led to a discussion in Europe that eventually, I believe, led to the French withdrawal. There are other reasons for that French withdrawal. For example, the now finalized presidential elections in France. But what we saw here is that the Danish presence in Mali was very much seen as complicit with the French one. And I think that's the reality of sort of international interventions in Mali and in the Sahelian region today, is that there's a massive critique against the leadership of France in these interventions, and the Nordic region is not sort of exempt from that criticism. And I think Nordic actors have been quite slow to realize this. They've expected to be greeted and sort of welcomed despite all the tensions with France, because our role historically has been different. Just to end then, that is, as I see it, the way international interventions have been playing out in Mali recently. on the backdrop of a quite worrying and complicated situation. I think, just to end, I just want to raise a few questions about the current situation in Mali. Maybe this is something Almamy wants to react to as well. I think a key question right now, which is also central to the dialogue between European actors in the region and Mali, is when and how will the next elections happen. The military junta is saying that they cannot guarantee free and fair elections until they have reestablished territorial control in all of Mali. And that will take, unfortunately, a decade, or I don't know, but it's very unlikely to see that kind of a military control happen in the near future, unless something very dramatic happens. So what should Europe do? Should Europe acknowledge that, yes, we need security before democracy in a way? Or is there an alternative to organizing elections despite the insecurity in Mali? Then it remains to be seen what the military junta can actually do against jihadist groups in Mali. They have promised to change the strategy and to engage in a more efficient combat against the jihadists present in Mali. So far, as far as I've seen, it's not necessarily a dramatic shift. What we've seen on the contrary is allegations that the Malian army, probably in collaboration with the Russian Wagner group, have been behind what seems to be a massacre of 300 people in a village in central Mali. That's sort of still being investigated, but it doesn't look good. It doesn't look as though the conduct of the Malian army is changing for the better. What will be the role of France in the future? And this is important to understand the international interventions in general. France still has a very important geopolitical and strategic interest in the Sahel region, in part because Europe is worried that the jihadist presence could pose a threat towards Europe as well. So France is not withdrawing from the region as such. It's probably investing more in its collaboration with Niger and Burkina Faso, the neighboring countries. But what will be the role of France in Mali moving forward? Is it possible to sort of shift the tide and engage more in local level conflict resolution, including dialogue with jihadist groups? I think that is part of what the military junta has promised. It's questionable that European actors will be very engaged in that kind of intervention, but I do think that that is probably necessary to see any kind of change, but that's really an open question as well. Will there be new military coups? I didn't expand on it a lot, but the structural sort of conditions of the way the state operates in Mali opens the possibility for new actors to try the same route. And then finally, and this is something that's sort of been a headline in European news a lot, is the Sahel region the new Afghanistan? That is this a region where you'll see international military interventions sort of rise and fail? And will it be sort of a region of sustained endemic armed conflict? I think you only have to look back 10 years to acknowledge that this is a fairly new situation for the Sahel region, and I don't see any reason why we should now just think of the Sahel region as prone to armed conflict. So I think that's an extremely problematic and very Eurocentric view of the situation. But of course, it's worrying that this political conflict is escalating presently and creating such destructive effects. All right, sorry for talking for so long. I hope this provides sort of something for us to discuss further. I don't know if people need a break or if you want to hand over the word to Almamy, but I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesper. It was really, really interesting to listen to your knowledge and awareness about the situation. I don't know what everyone else thinks, and it depends on if Almamy, do you feel like this is a good timing to add some discussion and comments. If so, I think that would be suitable to do now, and then we can end with some questions. Would that work for you?
Okay.
Or did you have something you wanted to present, or you want to follow up on what Jesper talked about?
Yes, I want to comment a little bit what Jesper said, and I have some point to emphasize. Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks, Jesper, for this excellent presentation. As I am a Malian, I learned a lot because based on what you said about the international intervention, the figures you presented was very relevant. Thanks for that. And based on that, the crisis that Mali is facing, I think we have to go beyond 2012 because for me, the international intervention, I have two kinds of views. You have the organized intervention actors, like MINUSMA, like French troop, like Barkhane. But before 2013, I think in 2000, 2001, 2003, 2006, we have the presence of jihad group. That presence is not a Malian presence. It is a foreign actors which came in Algeria, Pakistan, and they came in Mali, but not for the violent action, but they were present in Mali according to the religious practice. They were in Mali because they want to implement a new way to apply Islamism. But at that time, their presence was tolerated by a Malian state. I think this is the root of the crisis we are living now, because at that time they were present, but they were acting in hostage taking, and sometimes they were involved in drug trafficking, and sometimes they were involved in immigrant smuggling. But at that time, their presence was not a very problematic for a Malian state because their target was not a Mali state. But I think this is the root on that all these crises take profit now. I think this is a point to emphasize. And the second point I want to emphasize is the bad governance and the corruption in Mali. Because if we heard the discourse made by Emelela, it is like something they were not consider themselves as part of Malian national groups, because they were thinking as sometimes excluded in the state and sometimes in the development actions. I think this is a grievance that Emelela made to build their ideology for irredentism. I think this is also something I want to bring here. And The last thing I want to mention, but I'm not sure if I hear from Jesper, is the regional actors like ECOWAS, like IMO. I think there are also international actors. And after the second coup in 2021, Mali, as Mali is a landlocked country, Mali has 7 borders with its neighbors. The regional organization as ECOWAS took some action for the establishment of democratic practice. We have some embargo, but that kind of action are understood in several ways. If in Mali there are some people, some political parties thinks if we are in democracy, we have to align themselves with the good democratic practice. But there are some Malian who take ECOWAS cannot act like that because Mali is suffering with insecurity. Mali is a landlocked country, and this part of people thinks the action implemented by ECOWAS and EMOA is not targeting the state, but it is targeting the people. I think you have some kind of reading about this crisis based on the positionality of our politicians, of our national audiences regarding the crisis. And I think there is 3 points I want to add what Jesper is already said. I think it is relevant, all the points made by Jesper. I think as Malian, as an observer of the Malian political system, I am totally agree with him. Thanks. If there is a question, I can answer some.
Great, thank you, Almamy. I think you covered a lot, and I think it's good to you offer some perspectives as a citizen yourself in Mali, and if you have do you have anything to add, Jesper, or we can open up for questions to both of you, of course. So
yes.
the
Please.
floor is open.
Sorry,
what did you say, Almamy?
Yes, I want to address one point. What in the key question of Jesper, when, how to organize elections.
Sorry, what did you say to organize elections?
I said I want to address one point made by Jesper, when, how to organize election in Mali.
Okay. Yes, of course.
Okay. Jesper said we have to wait for a decade to organize the election because the Malian junta assume they have to fighting first security before organizing the election. If I understand well, Jesper, but I think there is some shift because there is since 3 days, I think 3 days, Malian Prime Minister was in the parliament, and that question was raised by some parliamentaries. He said, in my understanding, they plan to organize election in 24 months, because I think it is what they propose to the ECOWAS, and they think ECOWAS has no choice. Either they accept this 24 months, or they organize election. I think things regarding election are changing now, because we are not in 5 years of transition, we are not in 10 years, but I think they are now for 2 years to organize election. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that input, Almamy. So yeah, the floor is open for questions. You can raise your hand or you can write in the chat. It's up to you.
How do we raise our hands?
Oh, you could usually do that on reactions, but you can speak now if you have a question.
Okay. My name is Leka. I'm calling from Finspång here in Sweden. I actually would like to start by saying thank you very much, Jesper, for a fantastic presentation. Me being born in East Africa, Tanzania, these kind of conflicts are things which we rarely see. I mean, it's sad altogether to have a conflict in the continent, which is actually the richest in the world, with all the resources and so forth. I don't know if I was away for getting a glass of water during your presentation. Did you mention anything about the UN peacekeepers in Mali?
Maybe we can collect a few questions and I can answer, Leka. Yeah, but thank you very much. That's an important question.
Okay, so Mona has written in the chat, question to Jesper, what do you think is the best way to handle the crisis in Mali? A big question. Can we solve it tonight? Yeah, does anyone else have a question? So you can answer a few at a time, or both of you, of course. I could actually add a question kind of to both of you. How it matters when like you were saying, who takes the role if not France? How does it matter if the troops are like from other European countries or also from the region? Does it seem like some of them can contribute with more diplomatic approach or dialogue, or how are also the region, the countries around there intervening, affecting Mali and the military? Yes, so I guess that's for both of you if you have some input.
Almamy, do you want me to start, and you can clarify for me maybe? All right, so thank you very much for the questions. First of all, I'm really grateful to Almamy for being here and helping sort of clarify some points. I think especially emphasizing that, of course, the West African, the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, which is the regional organization, is a key international actor. And I usually criticize others for thinking Europe and the West when we say international actors, and then I did it myself because I was so keen on coming towards the Nordic angle. But I think that's key, and especially as Almamy said, the ECOWAS intervention has been, or the sort of the diplomatic role of ECOWAS has been quite important in the last 6 months since the most recent coup. So I think it's really important. And I think maybe it links a little bit to Johanna's reflection on sort of the difference between whether the troops themselves are European or African. I mean, the African Union generally has for a long time now sort of promoted the idea of African solutions to African problems, trying to take over the lead in international interventions. And there's been kind of a setback in that approach. So in the Sahel region, we have been back to the way things were before that you have European actors leading these missions, even though, as I showed you, most of the troops are actually from African countries, right? I think the question of whether, so that brings me a little bit to Johanna's question. So I think symbolically, it can be important in the international context that you have African troops on the ground leading an international intervention, whether it's a UN-led or an African Union-led intervention. I think it's important that you do have African troops on the ground. I don't think, and then sort of from the point of view of the populations in the areas where these troops are intervening, I mean, I don't think that sort of there's necessarily a big difference. I've worked quite a lot on the armed conflict in Côte d'Ivoire, which is Mali's neighbor to the south. And there, I mean, I rarely heard people distinguishing between different, so where soldiers were coming from. The blue caps were the blue helmets were the blue helmets. So the UN mission in Côte d'Ivoire was seen as one thing, regardless of where the soldiers themselves were coming from. I think it's really important. I mean, the presence of African troops in these international collaborations is extremely important. They bring a lot of important knowledge back to their further military career at home as well. And I think now, I mean, what you're seeing, for example, when the French troops were withdrawing from Mali, there was an attempt to travel, as far as I know, through Burkina Faso to Niger. And there were sort of, the French troops were met by protests, even in the neighboring countries. There was really sort of an anger against the French troops, because in part because of this whole question of the Françafrique, but also because of the poor record of France's military intervention in Mali. So I guess there you could say that symbolically, there's more problems around European soldiers than African ones in that sense. But then finally, I mean, the conduct of the soldiers themselves, I think, is very much an issue of leadership. It's very much an issue about the lack of a clear relationship between the Malian military and the international forces. And it's sometimes an issue that once a troop is deployed somewhere, they have very free range to do what they want. And there's been a lot of abuse locally by different armed actors because of that. So yeah, I think it's a difficult thing to sort of say categorically, but there's definitely a lot of symbolism around whether the troops are coming from one continent or the other. Leka, yeah, so I don't know if it was while you were away or not, but when I talk about the MINUSMA, the UN-led MINUSMA mission in Mali, that is sort of a UN peacekeeping mission. So the MINUSMA mission is there they have a mandate not to shoot first, as it were, to engage, to act in defense when they're attacked. And their main purpose is to sort of ensure security in the affected areas of Mali. So that is the peacekeeping mission. It might look a bit different than other peacekeeping missions, I don't know, in terms of their uniforms, for example. It's not, I don't know how many still carry the same blue helmets or not. But yeah, so there is definitely a UN presence. It will be even more important now that France is withdrawing. And Mona, the big question, maybe Almamy can help us here also. What is the best way to handle the crisis? I think it's important. I mean, as I understand the topic today, the issue of international interventions, I think it's important to say that not only has the international presence in Mali failed in combating jihadism, that would be bad enough, but the international missions have actually helped escalate violence. So things are worse now than when the international missions engaged. And the conflict dynamics are much more complicated. That's not all because of the international intervention, but I think it's important to acknowledge that that international intervention has not worked at all. So how do you handle the crisis? I do think that dialogue is key. And that goes both for sort of international diplomatic relations with the military regime, but it also goes for local conflict resolution and actually sort of engaging in dialogue with the jihadist groups as well. That is how you can negotiate temporary ceasefires, which can stabilize the situation in an area. But that is also how you sort of get people back to negotiating by non-violent means. It's very difficult. You either need to completely defeat the enemy on the battlefield or to combine military intervention with diplomacy. And in Mali, there's been very little diplomacy. So I think that's definitely key. And then I think it's key as well, and I'm not sure how to do that, but it's key to end impunity of armed actors in Mali. So the conduct of the Malian Army, but also of these local civil defense groups I showed you a picture of, has to be reined in, has to be taken much more seriously. And there has to be consequences when soldiers who have a mandate from the Malian state kill civilians or abuse civilians. There have to be consequences, and not just after the fact through the International Criminal Court 10 years later. It has to happen now. So those two things, dialogue and the end of impunity, I think are key. Yeah. Almamy, I don't know if you have another view, please.
Thanks so much, Jesper, for your response, and thank you for the participants for their question. I think I want to say more about African troops intervention, diplomatic glance, because I think, as you said, Jesper, African solution to African problem. I think African solution failed, because if African solution works, I am not sure international actors like MINUSMA, like France group are coming in Mali and fighting instability. Because at the beginning of this project, the Malian states asked ECOWAS, African unions, state to come together to
Sorry, Almamy, we have some trouble hearing you. Your mic and maybe connection.
Now is okay?
Yeah, it's better. Thank you.
I said at the beginning of the crisis, Malian states asked regional actors to come in Mali and to think about a solution like a regional forces to combat or to fight jihadism. But at that time, this solution was not implemented because the African troops lack trainings to fight jihadism, or what they call get asymmetric. I don't know how I can tell this in English.
Yeah. Irregular warfare is what it's usually called. Irregular warfare.
Okay, it's something like this because African forces were not prepared for that kind of war or conflict. African forces like the trainings, they lack money, they lack training. That's why Mali called international actors like MINUSMA, like France Troop Park Serval, after Serval, Barkhane, now Takuba, and G5 Sahel. Based on that, I think Malian crisis reveals that we have to think about what can be the future of African organizations, because African organizations are not responsible for that kind of situation. Because all time in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, they were not able to solve that kind of solution. Each crisis, the appeals of those actors. I think African organizations need capacities, need new capacities. The second question, what is a tricky question, how to handle a Malian crisis? Because in Malian crisis, you have 2 or 3 epistemic words. You have a Western world, which thinks we cannot negotiate with the terrorists. That means you have to fight them. We have Malian socio-cultural values, which appeals to negotiate, to dialogue. And we have the agenda of the jihadists, which are not accommodate with Malian thinking of Islam. I think we have 3 types or three categories of ideologies, which are not so, which are, how I can call this. The 3 types of ideologies are not, cannot go in the same way because there are so many contradictions. The Malian state want to negotiate, but the actors say they are terrorists, you have to fight them. But that international forces said also their mandate is not to fight them. Their mandate is to secure, is to set development program, but not to fight them. When the Malian state wants to fight them, they say that there are abuses on civilians. And at that time, terrorists and jihadists are killing people because of the Islam. And if I put all these things together, the Malian crisis is a multi-dimensional crisis. And I think we have to make responsible each of these actors. And I think this is my own opinion. I am not an expert on the security question, but I think negotiations, the dialogue now with jihadists or terrorists can be very difficult. But dialogue with MNLA, Tuareg rebels can be possible because since 2015, we have an agreement with MNLA for the peace. I think this is a good start. But how we can do the same thing with jihadists? who are another agenda, not something related to the good governances, but something related to some ideology, but that ideology is not shared by most of the Malians. I think it is here the point. I don't know how we can elaborate solution and response to that, but I think we have to thinking beyond all these three epistemic war to find a final solution to the crisis. Thanks.
Thank you, Almamy. I see we're getting more questions here. If anyone really he needs to leave, then of course you can do so. But we can, you that can stay, we can answer some couple of more questions and then round up. There was a question here in the chat already, so I think I would read this one, and then Leka and Sigrun. So a little bit far out, perhaps. So this is from Juan Obregon. But there are even tensions between Algeria and Morocco right now, a low intensive war between Morocco and Western Sahara. How does this affect the region? And should we continue with the other ones? See if there's maybe something similar. Leka, did you have another question?
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to comment on some few points here, especially from the previous speaker. Of course, I agree on a lot of points there. There was a very key and important word, diplomacy, which Jesper mentioned. And I think, I feel like the world should all of a sudden start to understand that the diplomacy dialogue should be the first thing to conduct before putting heavy military in any country in the world. As Jesper, you mentioned earlier, I don't think there's anywhere, it's Afghanistan, it's Iraq, it's Libya, whatever, there's no like a win whereby somebody comes back and say, now we've won. There are so many other issues which are cropping under the situations whereby the people are becoming resistant on certain things. These groups, I'm not from Malawi, I don't know, I'm from Mali, I don't know so much in detail the history and the rest of it, but I'm just trying to understand the surface of it, why people say no to certain thing. I mean, we live in Sweden. We know we can see some groups of people who are resisting certain things. Why are they doing that? It's because maybe some of their issues are not fulfilled. Mali is a rich country, as I said earlier. Do the people benefit on the natural resources which have been taken out of the country? No. So of course there will be people who raise questions, and then these people start to form groups. And I guess if there is issues like that, the dialogue and the diplomacy would have, of course, minimize, de-escalate all these conflicts. And I think sometimes it feels like putting military from outside the country, heavy military, which don't have much feelings for whoever crossed the road and just shoot, thinking everybody is a terrorist, really makes things way, way worse. I was just thinking that the involvement of France in this region, in the sense of military, is actually increasing the tension simply because of the history of colonialism and the rest of it. Maybe this would be the high time for the old colonial countries to change their strategies. Instead of using force, they use more diplomacy. Just a comment on that. There was no really question on there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leka. And then Sigrun had a question.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And here is another heavy question. I'm following the debates in the media and social media in Burkina Faso. I have a long interest in that country. And I've noticed in the last years, there has been an increase in anti-French sentiments, especially among young people. And I think the same is in Mali. And that is something which I can understand and sympathize with to some degree. But what is more difficult to understand is that there is a strong pro-Russian feelings also among young people. So, I mean, they can say we hate Macron and we love Putin, and Putin, the Russians should come and save us from this problem of terrorism we have. So that is a bit not so nice feeling when I see all these comments in the social media about people loving the Russians and hope for Wagner Group to come. And how should we understand this? And has there been targeted influence operations from Russia to French-speaking West Africa to plant these ideas? So, yeah.
Do you want me to start, Almamy? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for the good questions and reflections from all of you. Let me see. I think I'll start. I'll start with Juan's sort of reflection on whether tensions in North Africa between Algeria and Morocco might influence what's happening in the Sahel. One thing I'm not really sure, and I'm not maybe the right person to answer that question either. But what is quite clear is that much of the weapons and quite a lot of the key actors in some of the jihadist groups are from Libya and Algeria. So the sort of the previous militarization of North Africa has a key sort of role to play in why there are so many armed actors and weapons available to actors in the Sahel. That's not, an answer to your specific question about sort of the current tension between Algeria and Morocco, but I definitely think that it's important to see the link. And I know Almamy, for example, has looked at migration links between the Sahel and North Africa. So it's important to understand that the Sahara Desert still serves its own role as the sea, right? The sea between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, and the sea can be crossed. It's a line of traffic and communication, and part of that connection is with armed actors. So I think it's important to understand that role as well of North African actors, but I'm not exactly sure what's happening right now. And I don't know exactly how. I mean, what I'm not sure what interest either Algeria or Morocco would have in engaging in the Sahel. It might, yeah, I'm not exactly sure. So, but I think it's good to keep an eye towards North Africa as well. In terms of sort of the anti-French sentiment, Sigrun, I definitely recognize that as well, also from Burkina Faso, where I've done most of my sort of empirical research as well, and from what I see in the discussions around Mali and even Guinea. And I've been interested in the question you raise. One thing is to understand why young people today may have anti-French sentiments looking back at the history of French colonialism and this continued presence of France in the region. But why does that translate into pro-Russian sentiments? I have a stupid answer and perhaps a more thorough answer. The stupid answer is that I think generally, I don't know what you think, Almamy, but I think generally we tend to underestimate the role of Europe in West Africa, or the the ambivalent role of Europe in West Africa, and the sense that both Europe and the United States are sort of these powerhouses imposing their agendas on West Africa. I remember I spent some time in Dakar, and I was shocked to see Osama bin Laden hairdressers, like people using Osama bin Laden as an emblem on their hairdressing salons, etc., like in 2002, 2003. And I didn't really look into it, but that's the stupid answer, is that, you know, there's a lot of looking for alternatives to the hegemony of Europe and the US, I think. And maybe it doesn't go much deeper than that. It's just like, you know, as part of that anti-French, maybe anti-European sentiment, you might also then have, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. But then the more important issue that you raise is social media, and has there been sort of a targeted effort to influence public opinion in West Africa by Russia? I just read an article about it the other day, and there are at least sort of some concerns that Russia, I mean, first of all, especially now that Europe and the US are in a sort of a very tense situation in relation to Russia because of the war in Ukraine. I think it's important that to acknowledge that there's an ongoing information war happening right now. And I think we should be somewhat cautious of media reports on both sides, but particularly of attempts by Russia to influence public opinion, even in Europe, right? And I definitely think that there are attempts to influence public opinion in West Africa. I haven't seen sort of solid evidence, but I've seen more comments about it recently. The fact that you know that it's quite easy to set up social media accounts and then push information that is heavily pro-Russia. So I think those two, the stupid and the more serious answer in combination, the stupid one that there might just be this anti-reaction that then gets people to look for alternative sources of authority elsewhere, and then the more serious one that I think social media is a battleground, and I think it's being used. I'm not exactly sure what the implications are, but I think that is definitely something that to think about also when we think about conflict intervention, that public opinion is quite heavily shaped by social media these days in this region, and it's important to understand what's going on there. Maybe Almamy, you have something more substantial to add here.
Okay, thanks for the two questions. I think I will start with the question regarding Morocco and Algeria. I think Morocco and Algeria are key actors in Malian crisis, because in 2013, when IBK was elected, IBK targeted Morocco to train Islamic leaders, because in his understanding, Morocco Islam is a moderate, and they want to oppose moderate Islam to hard Islam implemented by the jihadists. Many of the jihadists at that time come from Algeria or in the northern African regions. I think there is something like this, but after Kibeka was trying this solution, it failed, and in 2015, he came in Algeria for a agreement between tribals and the Malian state. I think there is something like that, but I couldn't link with Sahara state cases. But I think the two actors play an important role in Malian crisis since 2012. The last question regarding the anti-France in West African, I think this is a very relevant question because in 2013, when French intervened in Mali, Malians were very enthusiastic because a Malian gave the name of the first French military killed in Mali to their baby. That's to show how at that time how Malian were very proud of French. But what changed at that time? Because after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of intervention, many Malians thinks the crisis is there, but French state was not very engaged to end the crisis because French army fights terrorists, but when they are in Gao or Kidal, they stop. I think this is to the point where the sentiment anti-Français developed in Africa, and I think also why there is a feeling pro-Russia feeling, because I think a human being search alternatives because French fails to fight all the crises, and in Mali there is so many militaries who were in Russia for training. They came and also they have developed some ideology like that. Russia has so many weapons. Russia can sell to Mali weapon, but regarding some human rights issues. And at that time also we have so many civil organizations which build program, pro-Russia program, and activists in social media communicate more on that program. I think it is to the point where pro-Russia feeling was developed and the sentiment anti-Français was fighting by the young people. This is my own opinion. I have no structured opinion, no research finding to confirm that. But as an observer of Malian politics, this is my own opinion regarding the two questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Almamy and Jesper, for your answers. I think we have to wrap up here soon because we delayed with some minutes. Unless there's anything you, Jesper or Almamy, want to add, or any question, we can. I see Andrea posted here in the chat. Of course, if you have any questions to us in FUF as well, or want to follow us, or contact us by email, you can send it here. You can send it, and you can look here in the chat for the email address and our Instagram link. And Olive popped up with a question here. Let's see if we can take this short. So why is it difficult for France to leave Mali? Mali's government and civilians are clear about the presence on French militaries. Is it possible to?
Yeah, a very short answer is just that there are too many strategic interests in not allowing jihadism to really sort of root itself in the region, right? If you want to take away everything about the history of France's relations, if you want to take away sort of the diplomatic pride of not being kicked out and just disappearing and all that, I think the strategic interest in preventing jihadism from spreading further, I think, makes it impossible for France to leave altogether. There are many other reasons, I think, but you can't discount that. Yeah, but we could talk a whole new seminar about this. I think maybe I'll end here for now.
Yes, definitely.
Almamy, do you want to add to that?
Okay. How difficult for France to leave Mali? I think
quick answer.
Quick answer. Because I think Mali is central in West Africa, because Mali is a land located country, but Mali has many links with African countries. I think if France leave Mali, this can be something like an escalation in other parts of West Africa, because as Jesper mentioned, it was a coup in Mali. 3 or 4 months there is a coup in Guinea. After in Burkina Faso, I think it is like a cycle. And I think Mali is central for French, because there is some key elements for that France can live in Mali. The ambassador of France left Mali. RFI and France 24 were close, but France is still there in Mali. I'm not sure it is based on what Jesper called to fight terrorism, because France left now Mali for Niger, but there is still presence of French in Mali. I think there is another reason for that.
Okay, thank you, Almamy, and I hope that answered your question, Olive. And as Mona posted, I'm not sure. A big thanks to Olive, who actually organized all of this and made it possible for Jesper and Almamy to participate tonight. And big thanks to you, Jesper, and to you, Almamy, for joining us and giving so much valuable, interesting insights and knowledge about this topic. And even with such short notice, Almamy especially, we really appreciate that you were able to join us tonight.